Okay, so Caitlyn Jenner. Caitlyn Jenner has come out and she has said that girls' sport in the US needs to be protected in recognition that there is a biological difference between trans women who are biologically male but identify as female and live as female and biological women, and that this manifests in the US as unfairness in sport. This is not shocking to anybody with a basic understanding of biology, but these comments are incredibly important, and they're important because they're coming from Caitlyn Jenner. Now, Caitlyn Jenner is currently running for office. I can't remember, something to do with governor or something. I don't really follow US politics. Now, the reason that these comments are important are not because whether they're her personal opinion or whether they're a road to Damascus moment, I don't care. What these comments indicate is that the political landscape has changed very, very seriously. Now, for the women like me who've been targeted by trans rights activists, and my targeting by trans rights activists came after 10 years of being targeted by the UK Labour Party and their associated Twitter culture. This is actually like a really, really important kind of comment, because we've actually lived through a period where appearing in public, speaking in public became dangerous for women because of trans rights activism. Now, if you go back through my earlier videos, which were mostly made in a period where austerity was coming to an end, or it was in its final years, and where the kind of really trans rights activists had a huge amount of pull in the UK. What I had already said very, very clearly from my first video was that this was not about trans people per se. There's very little connection between someone like Caitlyn Jenner and most trans people who are just kind of looking to protect their rights. And what I had said was that trans rights activism had actually come and took the very same form as most activism that emerges within kind of these Twitter cultures on the fringes of mainstream media cultures who can no longer reproduce their models. So The Guardian, the New Statesman, they commissioned abusive, very abusive males to present themselves as the face of trans rights activists, so that they could cover that they were trying to whitewash austerity and push it through, which was an attempt to undermine the entire rule of law around safeguarding equality legislation, a rule of law which reflected changes which had occurred in the last quarter of the 20th century. So this was changes to roles for women, changes in family structure, the emergence of the care economy, the emergence of safeguarding. And what I had said was that this was part of a natural correction that was occurring, that we didn't have to worry, that this would all be fine. And it is fine. It really is. What Caitlyn Jenner's comments indicate is that the political landscape has changed. Now, Caitlyn Jenner was the very much a figurehead of trans rights activism. She came out on Keeping Up with the Kardashians, which, I'm going to be honest, it's one of my favourite shows. I'm not slacking off the Kardashians. I love the Kardashians. But this is the American elite. And then through this, she became a very media visible figure, and this very, very media visible kind of form of activism, which had really just legitimized narcissism, which then reacted against all the rules of law that protected women. And unfortunately, it played out in schools, and it played out with young people, it played out in domestic violence shelters, it played out in rape shelters, in prisons with very, very vulnerable women. And what I had said was that this was part of a correction forcing recognition of those systems. Now, in the UK, action against trans rights activists was incredibly successful because all we really had to do, we didn't have to fight for any laws, we didn't have to fight for any changes. We already had the laws, we just had to say they existed. And so the media cultures like The Guardian, the New Statesman, who had tried to pretend that they didn't so that austerity would be uninterrupted, were forced to recognise them. Well, they didn't because they're narcissists, but government policy actually now does have to recognise them. And the combination of the outcomes of austerity, the combination of coronavirus forcing recognition of our social care systems, our health systems, trans rights activism means that that correction was coming to a natural completion in the UK. But in the US, some quite serious things happened that were not about trans rights activists. And Twitter in the UK produced Corbynism, where they turned on Jewish people for the first time, like, in UK politics since like the 1930s. You know, it unleashed the threat of fascism, but Labour are now dead in the water because of this. But in the US, it gave us Trumpism. And Trumpism was not a near miss. We ended up with this man as a president, and we ended up with a race war being fought out from the White House. And this acted as a test of institutional resilience in the US. Now, what Caitlyn Jenner's comments indicate is that the political landscape has changed very, very seriously in the US, and I wanted to talk about some of those changes. Now, Joe Biden is now currently the president in the US, and he was the deputy for Obama. And what Obama's tenure showed was what would happen if a black president emerged. And basically, the Republicans tried to shut the country down. Trump was a reaction against Obama, and what Trump, the dickhead spring and the threat of a fascist wave that shriveled up and ultimately failed, has done is it's now created a new political landscape. Now, I talk often about the theories of a woman called Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a very, very important, probably the most important legal scholar of the 20th century. And she is the woman who coined the term intersectionality. It doesn't mean what the dickheads on Twitter discuss, this vacuous, media-focused, narcissistic feminism. It's a theory about how systems fit together. And the origins of this theory are the experiences of black women across systems. This is an articulation of how marginalization reproduces across systems, how it's reflected in the rule of law, how it's reflected in media narratives, how it's reflected in activism. And one of the things that happened in the UK with the action against trans rights is that the very women who had been at the core of why we ended up with these prominent trans rights activists who were actually promoting some quite disturbing behaviours and, really, really attacking women, is the very same women who had commissioned and supported this because it hid their own kind of attempts to whitewash austerity, the New Statesman, the Guardian. They basically used the social movement that emerged against trans rights activism to demonstrate where trans rights activists had come from. The UK trans rights movement against trans rights, very quickly after the Gender Recognition Act review, which bound us all, became about the the binary between the far right and the centre left, and they demonstrated how they took that over and recreated that in a social movement. Almost immediately, the movement against trans rights activism became as dangerous as trans rights activism itself, and we saw where trans rights activism had come from. But the thing is, nobody's actually looking at Twitter anymore, because we all know that every single movement that comes through Twitter results in the same thing, this narcissistic tribalism that's dangerous for anybody, quite frankly, who is not a sociopath. Now, when you're looking at power, it's actually best to look at where power actually is. And where power actually is not Twitter. That's just a place where dead media cultures are spinning in circles and having the same conversation over and over again, unaware that the context has changed around them. And one of the things that I recently watched was a fashion show for Louis Vuitton. I think it was fall 2021. A guy called Virgil Abloh, his name is, and he's Kanye West's protege. This fashion show, this guy is going to change fashion. This guy is actually one of the greatest designers that has existed in a very, very long time. He can do knitwear, he can do tailoring, but his vision is incredible. But he's a young black man, and he's taken Louis Vuitton from being a slightly staid luxury goods house to being at the forefront of fashion, not just in Paris, but globally. And this is in an age when, fashion houses are having to cater to a multipolar world and a very rich East and a West who are not that kind of relevant at the minute. Now, the reason I mention Virgil is that he was Kanye West's protege. Kanye West is he's the stepson-in-law of Caitlyn Jenner. I don't quite understand the family dynamics. But this is the American elite. And in the period where Trump has been in office, Trump has really he's acted as a test of institutional resilience. People realised a race war was being acted out. But in America, you're talking about an incredibly powerful, the American elite has changed. Beyonce's music became much more political. Rihanna's music became much more political. Virgil Abloh is now at the head of Louis Vuitton. British Vogue, which would die in a death, have a black male editor. And what's happened is that the tide has come in and people's feet are wet. And what Caitlyn Jenner's comments actually indicate is this. Now, Joe Biden, who was connected to Obama and experienced this world where Obama couldn't get a mandate because every time he got behind closed doors, nobody would work with him. The people behind Joe Biden, the very powerful networked black women behind Joe Biden, who've also had to deal with the racist, nasty, misogynist Bernie Sanders US Corbyn equivalent, they now have a mandate, and there's not going to be a single person in the White House who doesn't understand what the term intersectionality means. So in the UK, we've had trans rights activism, we've had austerity, we have had coronavirus to bring home to policymakers that these systems have to be recognised. In the US, we have Joe Biden, and we have this new landscape where these black women have a mandate and have power and have a president. And all of a sudden, this correction is kind of complete. And this is where Caitlyn Jenner's comments come in. In order to be electable, Caitlyn Jenner has to now distance herself from the toxic trans rights activism, acknowledge there is a biological difference between trans women and biological women, and that doesn't need a caveat, women, and actually recognise that in the US, where there has been a non-development of welfare state, where they didn't have safeguarding laws that UK activists could rely on, the front line is girls' sport in schools and girls' sport full stop. Now, Caitlyn Jenner used to be an Olympic athlete when she was Bruce Jenner, so I kind of wonder whether these comments are actually quite sincere, but I don't know. But what I wanted to discuss today was just that, the way that Caitlyn Jenner's comments indicate that the political landscape has changed. Now, Twitter is still going in the same circles that it's been going in for 10 years. It's unleashed fascism, and in its own way, it's changed the balance of world power. But it's done so by rendering these noxious, narcissistic, racist, nasty, horrible media organisations obsolete, trapped them in circles in a little digital bubble. And in the meantime, the world has changed. The tide has come in, people's feet are wet. Men like Virgil Abloh are changing, French fashion is about the elite globally. This is about setting the tone for the elite globally. So that was my two penneth on Caitlyn Jenner.